Welcome back to another class on Dalat Amot Shel Halacha. Ein Lola Kadosh Baruch Hu Be'olamo Eila Arba Amot Shel Halacha Bilvad. We are still in the Chazara program. This will be part 6 of the Shi'ur. Today we want to discuss two important halachot. Halacha number 1 we want to try to see today. What happens if a person daven the tefillah of the Arevit of Mot Shabbat during Shabbat itself? Is he still allowed to continue eating? Or another halacha we want to try to see. What happens if during the Sudah Shalishi that you are having and you needed to daven Arevit? What is the procedure afterwards? Do you have to do Havdalah before you eat or not? Or another example. What happens if you are in the middle of Sudah Shalishit and you're getting a phone call or something, there's a malachat that needs to be done in the house. You need to turn the light, anything. And you said, Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. When you have to continue back with your meal, do you have to do Havdalah first, or you can continue in your meal? These are two halachot that we want to try to see today, Be'ezrat Hashem. Comes Rav David Yosef Shlita, Afilu im itpalel tefilat Arevit shel Motzei Shabbat mi be'od yom. Even if a person prayed the Arevit prayer of Motzei Shabbat during the day of Shabbat, asur lo le'echol le'achar miken ad sheyavdil alakos. It is forbidden for him to eat afterwards until he does Havdalah on a cup of wine. Now I want to just try to show you what is going on over here. When can one daven Arevit on any given day after Plaga Mincha? How do we calculate Plaga Mincha? Let's just take, for example, a perfect 12-hour day, a perfect 12-hour night. So let's say 3:30 p.m. is Mincha Katana. 6 o'clock is when the stars come out. From 3:30 till 6 is 2.5 hour difference. Divided it into 2, you're going to get an hour and 15 minutes. Take an hour and 15 minutes back from 6 o'clock, or take an hour and 15 minutes and add it to the time of 3:30, you're going to fall out at 4:45. That is called Plaga Mincha. Between Mincha Katana and when the stars come out, between that time, you take that time, you divide it into 2. Whether you want to go back from the night an hour and 15 minutes, whether you want to add the hour and 15 minutes to the time of 3:30, you're going to come to 4:45. 4:45 is called Plaga Mincha. It's called half of the Mincha time. So from Plaga Mincha, you're allowed to go ahead and start davening Arevit. Comes Rav David Yosef Shlita, he says like this. Came a person and he went and he davened Arevit at 4:46, which is after Plaga Mincha. You would have thought, since you still have time until 6 o'clock to be able to eat, say he started davening 4:45 and he finished the Arevit prayer of Mot Shabbat at 5 o'clock. It's still Shabbat. Shabbat didn't come out yet. But he wants to know, does he have that 1 hour that where he can still continue eating his food? Yes or no? Because he's still in Shabbat. You might tell me it's Orik Shabbat. Comes Rav David Yosef Shlita and he says, once you daven Arevit, even though it's during the day of Shabbat itself, where you have the mitzvah of Onik Shabbat, once you daven Arevit of Motzei Shabbat, after Plaga Mincha, during Shabbat itself, even though you have time after that, before the sun sets, we're going to tell you you're not allowed to eat anything until you do Havdalah on a cup of wine. Continues Rav David Yosef and he says, Aval, however, im hivdil alakos mi be'od yom. What happens if a person went ahead and he did Havdalah on a cup of wine during the day of Shabbat? Again, we're speaking about after Plaga Mincha. He went ahead and he did Havdalah at 4:46. Rashai le'echol la'achar miken. He's permitted to eat afterwards because he did Havdalah. Ava pisha adayin lo birech al haner ve'al besamim. Even though he still didn't bless on the candle and on the spices, on the fragrance. Because we know when you do Havdalah, you have to say the bracha on the cup of wine, on the besamim, and also on the ner. But the problem is when you're doing Havdalah on Shabbat day itself, you can't say the bracha on besamim because Shabbat didn't come out yet. The whole purpose of the besamim is to awaken the person's neshama because the other neshama leaves him. The purpose of the light is because that's when light was created on Mot Shabbat. So these two brachot of Bisamim and Ner, they're out the window. So you're not really saying those brachot. So you would have thought to say that if a person, for let's say he had a reason to why he had to do Havdalah during the day of Shabbat, let's say after Plag Mincha, so he has another hour. You would have thought to say, since maybe he didn't do all three brachot, he's not allowed to eat until Shabbat is completely out. And then he goes ahead and he says the Bisamim blessing and the candle blessing. Comes Rav David Yosef Shlit and he tells you, no, that's not the case. If a person went ahead and he said Havdalah during Shabbat day itself, even though he didn't say the blessing on the Ner and the Bisamim, he's allowed to eat from there and on. However, comes Rav David Yosef Shlit and he says that this whole minhag or this whole halacha, if you guys remember, we spoke about it also when we were doing the Shulchan Aruch with the Mishnah Berurah, that this whole halacha is not so simple. To go ahead and because the Shulchan Aruch is clear, it says you're allowed to do it. But Rav David Yosef Shita is going to tell us that we should stay away from this practice. Comes Rav David Yosef and he says like this: Umikol makom, nevertheless, kvar nidbe'er le'el behalacha birura Siman Reish Tzad Gimel Sivchet. It was already explained in the halacha birura above in Siman Reish Tzad Gimel halacha chet. She'amnam l'dad rabotena harishonim, that however, according to the Rishonim, mutar limishu anus lagdim ulitpalel tefilat aravi shel Mot Shabbat mibeod yom achar plag mincha. It is permissible for one who's an oinus, one who is forced, or one who has no choice, but to daven the tefilat aravit of Mot Shabbat during the day of Shabbat after plag mincha. Umutar lo av lavdil alakos, and he's even permissible to go ahead not only to daven aravit after plag mincha, but he's also permissible to go ahead and do the havdalah on a cup of wine if for whatever reason he has no choice. He's not going to be able to do it afterwards. And he doesn't bless the blessing of the candle and the blessing of the spices. This is according to the opinion of the Rishonim. So one more time, let's do this one more time. That according to the Rabbeinu Rishonim, one is permissible to go ahead if he's an oinus, meaning if he's forced, or if he has no choice, but to daven aravit after plag mincha, or to do havdalah after plag mincha. The Rabbeinu Rishonim, the rabbis, which were the Rishonim, they tell you clearly one is allowed to do like the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. One is allowed to go ahead if he's forced. He's allowed to daven aravit after plag mincha. And he's also allowed to go ahead and do the havdalah then. Just make sure you don't do the brachot of the Bisamim and the brachot of the candle. Ulam, here we go. This is all the opinion of the Rabboteina Rishonim. Ulam Rabbim Miraboteina Achronim Katu. However, many of the later generation rabbis, they wrote, Shah minhag ata, that the minhag nowadays, Shelo lahagdim litpalel aravi shel Mot Shabbat mibeod yom. A person should not proceed and daven the aravit of Mot Shabbat during the day. Absolutely not. Va'afilu kishu anus. Even if you are forced, even if you have no choice but to do it on Shabbat, don't do it. Why? Because it looks in the eyes of people like something nuts. Like, why is he davening aravit when it's still Shabbat? To go ahead and daven the regular weekday prayer and to go ahead and do havdalah while it's still Shabbat, that doesn't look right in the eyes of the people. And furthermore, we should be concerned. Maybe the Ama'ars, maybe the ignorant people that don't know the halacha, they're going to think that since they davened aravit and they did havdalah, they're allowed to do work while it's still day, but that's a problem. You're not allowed to. Even though it's still day, so that's what he's going to tell you over here, that the minhag nowadays is not to use this heter at all. If somebody's an onen, what's an onen, lo leinu? We have an onen and we have an avel. An avel is a mourner, lo leinu chas v'shalom. He becomes a mourner after they bury the deceased person. What's an onen? Onen is before the burial process. If the family does not hand over the body to the another people, like to the mitaskim, the people that deal with the funeral, meaning they're still together with them, that they're considered to be onen, they can't do any mitzvot, they can't do any berachot, nothing. So if chas v'sham lo'olenu rabotai, a person found out that somebody lo'olenu died on Shabbat, and now he's in onen, but he can't follow the laws of onen on Shabbat, that's what we're going to tell him that only if he's in onen, adiv yoter, it is better shitpalal tefilat aravit v'yavdil ala kos me'ba'od yom. Now it's better for him to go ahead and daven the aravit of Mot Shabbat after Plag Mincha and do the havdalah on a cup of wine, because afterwards he's not going to be able to do it because they're going to bury the person very late. So he'll miss havdalah and he's going to miss aravit. But he says over here, believe birkat haner or birkat b'samim. However, he shouldn't say the blessing of the candle and the blessing of the spices. Like it's explained over there in Halacha Tet. Now, that was the first part of the question. Now we want to go ahead and deal with the second part of the question. What happens if a person went ahead and he davened aravit during Sudah Shalishit? So he says like this: if a person interrupted in the middle of his bread meal and he went and he davened aravit, he needs to do havdalah on the cup of wine before he continues his meal. So a person could be in the middle of Sudah Shalishit, and the Sudah Shalishit is dragging. I don't know, they're having a lot of people came over, whatever the situation might be. But the person knows that the minyan is going to be at a certain time, and he will make it. So during the meal, he gets up and he goes and he davens aravit, and then he comes back home. Can he continue eating the bread meal? Absolutely not. What does he have to do? He first has to go ahead and do havdalah, and then he can continue eating. He says here, tzarich lavdil ala kos, kodem sheyamshich b'sudato. He needs to go ahead and do the havdalah on a cup of wine before he's going to continue in his meal. Aval, however, he says, im hu tzrach la'asot malacha b'toch sudato. What happens if he needed to do malacha? He needed to pick up the phone. I don't know. He wanted to see the news. Something happened. Whatever. Any form of malacha which is asur on Shabbat, he wanted to do after Shabbat, but still he's in the middle of the third meal. Ve'amar baruch hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol, because we saw you're allowed to use it. He said baruch hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol, and then he went and he did the malacha. Should he now go back and do the havdalah, or is he allowed to continue eating? Comes Rav David Yosef and he says, Rashai lamshich b'su'udato. He's allowed to continue in his bread meal. Va'afilu asa malacha. Even if he did the malacha, he's allowed to continue in his bread meal without saying havdalah. V'chol shitpalel aravit shel Mot Shabbat b'toch su'udato. Anybody who davened the aravit prayer of Mot Shabbat during his meal, kishemevarech birkat hamazon la'acher miken, afterwards, meaning after you did the havdalah and you went back to continue the bread meal, or even, let's say you were in the middle of the Sudah Shalishit and the minyan was going to pass by, so you went and you davened, and now when you're coming back you have to bless Birkat HaMazon. Doesn't matter whichever case. When you're going to go and you're going to bless Birkat HaMazon afterwards, Eina omer retzeve hachalatzenu. You shouldn't say the Shabbat blessing that we institute on Shabbat, which is retzeve hachalatzenu. V'yesh omrim, and there are those that say, Shafilu amar baruch hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. There are those that say that even if you said baruch hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol in order to be able to do malacha during the meal, b'toch su'udotah during the meal, eina omer la'achar miken retzev hachalatzenu b'berkat hamazon. You shouldn't say the Shabbat prayer in the middle of the Birkat HaMazon, that which we institute. Okay, so let's just do a small review. We began opening up today that if a person went ahead and he davened the aravit prayer of Mot Shabbat after Plag Mincha during the day of Shabbat, he is not allowed to eat anything until he does Havdalah. That was point number one. Point number two was, but if he went ahead and he did Havdalah on a cup of wine during the day, even though he didn't say the bracha on the ner and the besamim, he's allowed to go ahead and he's allowed to eat afterwards. Nevertheless, we saw that even though we have Rabbeinu Rishonim, the earlier rabbis, where they say that somebody who is forced or somebody who has no choice and he wants to proceed to go ahead and daven Aravit after Plaga Mincha and to do Havdalah after Plaga Mincha, the Rabbatein Rishonim say mutar, you're allowed to do it. Nevertheless, the Rav David Yosef Shlita concluded minhag nowadays the minhag nowadays is that you shouldn't proceed even if you're in oinus, even if you're forced to daven Aravit and you have no other choice. We're going to tell you not to daven Aravit after Plaga Mincha, not to do Havdalah after Plaga Mincha, only because we are afraid that the Aratzot, they're not going to be able to make that distinction. They're going to think, oh, I daven Aravit, I did Havdalah, why can't I do Malacha? But he doesn't realize that he's still in Shabbat, until we have to wait until Shabbat is completely out. And we also said that it's Davar Tamuah. It looks very strange in the eyes of people to go ahead and daven Aravit of Mot Shabbat on Shabbat and to do Havdalah of Mot Shabbat on Shabbat. So that's why we said over here that the minhag nowadays is not to proceed to go ahead and daven Aravit of Mot Shabbat during the day, even if he's in the oinus, even if he's forced to do it, right, like we explained, and also he shouldn't go ahead and also do the Havdalah. However, we did say, but somebody who was in the onen lo leinu chas v'shalom, somebody who lost a relative, and now let's say they're going to bury him chas v'shalom on Sunday. So now, Rabotai, is going to be a very big problem when he's going to do Havdalah, and he's not going to be able to daven Aravit. Over there, in the onen lo leinu, we're going to tell you, it is better that he pray, and only he's allowed to pray the Aravit prayer of Mot Shabbat after Plaga Mincha during the day of Shabbat, and also go ahead and do the Havdalah on a cup of wine without the blessings on the candle and on the besamim. Then we saw another halacha that if a person interrupted his meal in the middle of his meal to go ahead and daven Aravit, when he wants to continue his meal, he's not allowed to until he does Havdalah. Once he did Havdalah, then he's allowed to go ahead and continue his meal. However, what happens if all he needed to do, he's not going to daven Aravit. All he needed to do right now was go ahead and say, all he needed to do right now is go ahead and do Malacha. So during the meal, he said, Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. Since it's already after Shabbat, he used a language which separates him from Shabbat, and he went and he did the Malacha. Over here, we're going to tell you, you are allowed to go ahead back and continue eating without having to do Havdalah. However, we did mention that in both of these cases, that whether you daven the Aravit of Mot Shabbat during the meal, or whether if you said Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh L'chol during the meal, in both of these cases, when you're going to go and bench and say the Birkat HaMazon, you should not say Retzeh v'hachaletzenu inside the Birkat HaMazon. Rabotai, have a great day. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.